Thanks, guys. I'm here with writer and columnist Kate Fagan from ESPNW. Kate, how are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Great. We're happy to have you. So tell me a little bit about how you started your career in sports journalism.
Well, I played college basketball, and so I already had an interest in sports, and I really wanted to be a writer. At first, I was asking you this at lunch about whether you wanted to write books or novels or nonfiction, and that's what I wanted to do. I was like, oh, I want to write fiction, but unless you have some sort of inheritance, you can't necessarily sit around writing the next great American novel. So I got into sports journalism because I was like, I want to write, and I know sports, and then this future idea of being a novelist, like I'll just chip away at that while I do journalism. So I started in Boulder, Colorado, and then I worked my way up through newspapers until I got to ESPN.
Hey.
It's the quick version.
The quick version. So do you miss ever being on the road and being on a beat and covering an actual team versus now you do more long form feature stories?
Yeah. I miss it all the time because at least when I covered the Sixers, it was almost like the feeling of having a 9-to-5 or some sort of labor job where it's at the end of the day I'd be like, I accomplished something today, and it was because I'd put out a story on the game and then blog posts on the game, and it was pretty much every single day there was a finished product of your work, and that was rewarding. And to have the constant communication and feedback with the Sixers fan base who were so interested in that particular team, and then going over to ESPN and doing more long form, sometimes there'll be months between putting out a piece and there's not that same sort of daily reward, even though you've probably chipped away at something. There's still the feeling of when you get feedback on your work that you can't necessarily replicate when you're only doing stuff every few months.
Okay. You talk about interacting a little bit with fans and whatnot. Did you ever get any backlash of being a woman in sports, or did you get a little bit better experience with that?
I had a pretty good experience, at least with the Sixers and covering the NBA. It seemed like that fan base in particular was just thirsty for somebody who was going to be passionate about their team. And I almost felt like they thought, because it came in the form of a female sports journalist, they thought it was even cooler. They were like, oh, she covers our team that we're passionate about, and she seems passionate about it. This is the coolest ever, was the feedback there. I think at ESPN itself actually has always been so supportive of diverse voices, whether it's race or gender, because it's always seen itself as a place that it has the brand quality to be able to hire outward facing anyway, reporters and voices that are a little bit different. But that doesn't mean ESPN can control the response to those voices. And so when you're at ESPN and it's such a large platform, there are going to be everyday sports fans out there who don't necessarily want to hear sports from a woman, or don't want to hear sports from somebody that they consider marginalized, and it just seems different to them. And sometimes it's impossible to control that feedback.
Okay. And did you get more interaction with users now that you've stepped into the realm of broadcast? You're on Around the Horn and His and Hers. Have you been enjoying more interaction that way?
Enjoying, I'm not sure, but I've had more interaction, which is probably your question, right?
Yeah.
Because for some reason, it's when you put yourself on TV or when ESPN puts you on TV, it feels like it's just a green light for sports fans to no longer think of you as a human being almost, and to kind of open the door to whatever criticism they want to offer. Perhaps they don't feel like it actually lands on a human being because you're on TV. And so all of a sudden you're just this mirage in a box, which has definitely happened since I've started doing ESPN. I totally noticed that first of all, there's more feedback, whether you're talking about social media feedback or even on my email, and there's a greater disconnect from those people thinking I'm a human being, rather than just a human inside of their piece of technology. So there seems to be more leeway to say whatever they want to say. But mostly on Twitter and stuff, I would say I get 80% positive feedback. So I try and at least push to the side some of the ones that are actually supposed to be purposefully hurtful.
Is there a favorite show that you have right now, that either radio or broadcasting, that you're really into or want to dive into more that you haven't yet?
One that I'm a part of?
Yeah.
I just started doing this radio show with other ESPN. I guess he's technically talent because he's not necessarily a writer, but his name's Will Kane, and he's from Texas, and he's at least he would describe himself this way, conservative and Republican. And I think they put us together because they felt like it would be this like clash of ideology, which it has been. But it's also been fun because we really like each other. And it was like when we first met, I think we weren't necessarily like listening to what the other person was saying. We were just assuming that we knew what they were going to say. And Will and I, it's a radio show on Sunday mornings. Will and I talk all the time about how we think we're actually kind of a metaphor for like all of America right now, where you've got two different sides. It's like they're not actually even like taking the time to get to know or listen to one another. Because once you're in a room with somebody, like you're gonna not try to find opposite ground. You're gonna try and find common ground. Because it's strange to be in a room with somebody and like not want to find your commonalities, which is what ends up happening on this radio show. Well, at the same time, like every show, we of course like disagree about something, but we also like do it in a like loving, respectful manner, which there might need to be more of these days.
Okay. And what type of dialogue have you all opened up on the show that some people are a little more touchy about?
Like we talk about race all the time. We talk about sexuality. We talk about women's sports, and like I'm often the voice that's like, I'm trying to break down the reasons why women's sports are not as popular. And he's more of like well, maybe they're just not as popular, like let's, and we talk about equal pay for equal play, like the national women's soccer team issue. So I think what we try and do is like, because we each assume the best of one another, we're not afraid to go into dicey territory. Like we started off one show and Will just got a new shirt and he's like, does this shirt make me look gay? Which like, if I didn't trust him, I'd be like, what are you trying to say, about gay people? But because we trust each other, like I know it's coming from a good place, and we end up being able to get different places in the conversation that we might otherwise be able to get.
Okay. And switching more to like your feature writing and everything else, Split Image has gotten a lot of attention in the past year and still now. How did you go about writing that piece when it was such a touchy subject?
A lot of time. A lot of patience, because it felt like one of those stories that you either needed to have the cooperation and the insight from her family, or you weren't going to be able to do anything meaningful anyway. So that story was a year in the making, from when at ESPNW we first decided to do it to when we actually published it online and on in the magazine. And it was definitely a hard process as a writer, because all of your stories, the longer ones you carry around with you, especially until they're published, because it's like, it's this emotional weight. You have this story you want to tell, and until you actually introduce it to the world, it's like, it's in your head, and you're like the guardian, the custodian of it, which is how I felt about that story more than I'd ever felt about any other story. It was like I was its custodian, and there was a level of, I think, pressure that I think all storytellers feel, because you want to tell it in the most breathtaking way possible, because you're like, this is so important, and I'm the one who's been allowed to write it, so I better write it or tell it in the most smart, impactful, meaningful way, or else I'm not doing it justice.
Okay. And how did you go about like putting it all together, like structurally wise? Like, were you like, this is gonna be my lead, like this is what I'm gonna use, or did it just like come to you? Or never when I write a story do I end up with the lead that I start with in the finished product. Almost always, actually, whatever I think is going to be my lead at some point becomes my ending, which is a very interesting phenomenon, at least within like the stories I write. It ended up getting rearranged a lot of different ways, because you're always fighting how somebody else would tell a story, whether it's an editor, and you're also fighting the urge to tell something chronologically. But then if you want to do it in some sort of creative way, are you risking the reader's ability to comprehend when things happen and how things happen? So that happened a lot with that story, because at first I was like, I want it to be different, right? I want to tell it in a new manner. I want to have it jump all over in time. But then you realize at some point you're sacrificing readability, because you want to be creative and artistic in the way you tell it. So that story got rearranged, and I think in the end we bounced a little bit around in time, but we tried to keep long chunks of it
chronological because we thought it was the most important way to actually get across the emotional impact, so readers weren't wasting their time being like, when is it? Where am I? And just let them sort of feel the story.
Yeah, because it starts very impactful. Like you start basically like at the climax when she does jump off like the building. Basically, it's like you start off with like the toys that she brings for her family and everything else. And how was it talking to her family leading up to the moments where their daughter passed away?
It was challenging, and it was emotional, and not necessarily like the way we deem emotional, like crying and like, because I think during some of the video interviews that happened when we hit certain parts, like that they would become emotional. But it was exhausting and challenging because having to just be in the presence of a family who was well deep in the grief process. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like kind of being in the middle of like just a wave, because it's not like this happened 20 years ago and they're like, let us tell you this story of our daughter. Like, this was a story that was happening minute by minute for them. Because at the first time I sat down with them, I think it was like 7 months after, which really isn't a lot of time when you're talking about the death of a child. So it just it did become tiring, in a good way, to like put yourself in that energy, and then hopefully that would then translate to your writing, because you felt it more, you were in that presence. Like, I went to the top of the parking garage. I hope that I could convey the kind of like melancholy that you felt when you were in those places.
Okay. And what do you hope that other journalists, when they are, writing or doing video or anything for social issues and, human interest pieces and have to captivate like very emotional things, what do you hope that they can do better? They can tell the story better, but also be I'm not saying like invasive, but at the same time, like tell the story, give it like, I don't really know what I'm trying to say. Like,
like just how
tell
they
it the
can
right way.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just such a unique path for everybody who tells one of these stories. Like, if at some point you're coming across a story that is extremely emotional, it's like you have to use your own internal compass about when you say what and how you report it, when to ask for certain things. Because I do know that specific story, Split Image, probably was missing some crucial emotional pieces because I personally didn't feel comfortable asking for them. Like, I didn't have her diary for that. I had the relay of what one diary entry said, but I'm sure if I had certain other pieces, I could have painted a fuller picture. But I had to trust what I felt like as a human being could ask for at certain points, and then it got to a certain place where I'm like, this is the story I'm able to tell, and I'm going to tell that story the best. And now that I'm writing a book about it, like I have more information, but it came at the right time. It didn't come where my goal was always like, what matters more than the story is that the family feels like they have control and that it's still their story.
Okay. And what do you hope people take away from that story when they read it?
I really hope that it's helpful to college-age kids or high school kids who maybe didn't know that they were feeling a certain way, but then that story named it for them. And by that I just mean, sometimes we have a hard time, especially when we're like in college, because it's like the time when we're supposed to think we know the most, and when we're supposed to be having the time of our lives, that it can be hard to articulate that not everything is great. And if that story gives people the ability to be like, yeah, I was feeling like this, or I can see myself starting to go down that path, that at least now there's an open door to have conversations that maybe you couldn't. And that was some of the feedback I got, like with people who emailed me. It was like kids who were maybe in their first year of college could just forward that article to their parents, and be like, this hits home for me. And then maybe they can talk about things that they wouldn't talk about otherwise.
Okay. And you kind of felt a little bit like that just from reading your memoir. You kind of were in that same spot where you did feel lonely in college and you didn't really know what was wrong with any of that. Did you ever feel like, I can't take the easy way out like Madison, or did your faith kind of keep you more grounded in the environment that you were in?
I'm having trouble answering that question because I'm actually just noticing what a great transition that was by you. That was a very good transition from one question to the next. That was like professional transition question asking. There are a lot of similarities between what I think Madison was probably going through and then my memoir in terms of finding yourself in a place where you're questioning your identity and the choices you've made. And, the best case scenario with the Madison story would have been if it did become a coming of age story. Mm-hmm. And of course it wouldn't have been told because these things happen every day. Is like a young person working through something and then finding who they are, and then it becomes a coming of age story. And then you have lessons that you've learned from it, which is what I hope, my memoir is talking about is like, okay, I was in sort of a place where I didn't feel accepted and I felt like an outsider, but again, I wasn't battling with mental health issues, which adds a different variable. But then I hope that book has like some life lessons for certain people who might also feel the same way. And I'm hoping the Madison piece, even though she's not here to learn and share those coming of age life lessons, for some people they can see where certain parts of her story took a turn, and where maybe their own, they can not go down that same path.
Okay. And I know you were still battling with religion in your story a little bit, kind of like making and understanding everything. Are you still religious today?
Yeah. No. Sorry, I was like, yes, I get your question. No, and I'm not like, or I don't practice organized religion. And that's actually, I try and make a concerted effort to not make that seem like I have any sort of disdain for organized religion. It's just a personal choice after having explored religion where I'm like, that doesn't resonate with me the way that I know it does with millions/billions of other people. And like my own path on what I think faith is has been very different than what the traditional way we're taught within society. And by that I just mean like I'm more of like I believe in like a general sense of like world is bigger and there are certain higher powers. I don't think we've pinpointed and named them the way that certain religions believe that we have. But I now have a very good relationship with like faith and religion, and I understand like the level of community it builds, and it's just not one of those things that like in my life I've ever found has like been a hole that I need to fill with religion.
Okay, yeah, and being so young as well, you're just getting to know yourself, so kind of having that on top, it's like, whoa.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, and sometimes you think when you're young, at least I remember thinking this, that like I knew more than ever what I wanted because I thought I was supposed to know more than ever what I wanted, when in reality I was just like still just trying to figure out who I am. But there was that sense of like, at least I remember in college being like, I know what I want because this is what I'm supposed to know what I want. And then looking back and realizing, wow, like so much has changed about the things that I think I care about and want and all that. Like I used to drink Starbucks all the time. That was weird. Now I only drink craft coffee.
Only craft coffee.
Only craft, artisanal coffee.
So if you could, I know this is a basic question, but if you could go back and tell yourself, like, 19, 20-year-old self, like, what would it be?
It would definitely be to trust people way more, because I think we all get caught up in whatever story we've told ourselves about some part of ourselves, whether it's an actual like body part, like you can tell yourself a story of like, oh, I have the ugliest, hips ever. And no matter what, like that's the story you've built. And I constructed this story that like nobody would be okay with me being gay. Like that was the story I told myself and believed. And what ended up happening was like I reinforced that idea by not telling people, or by the people I did tell, telling them in a way that made it seem like it was a negative, which then they responded like, oh, how can we help? Rather than being like, I'm gay, this is amazing. And they'd be like, well, okay, that's great. So I would definitely want to go back if I could. I would try and from a much earlier age just be like, trust people, to be fine, and also present the information in a way that made it clear that I was fine.
Okay, yeah, that makes more than sense. And how about your parents? Because I know they were accepting, but then at the same time thought it was a phase, but you don't really talk about it at the end of the book of how they feel now.
Yeah, and we're great now. We're probably better now than we've ever been. And there are certain things in the book, like my relationship with my family, where like you're kind of making this, as a writer, you're making this choice of like, well, I want to tell more, and I want to tell all the stories, and I want to tell the full truth, whatever truth means. But you're like, I'm also somebody's daughter who has to then like maintain all these relationships, right? So like you definitely, and I'm hoping like the book has like the truest truth I can offer without necessarily giving everybody everything, because I still have to go out and like live my life and be me and maintain certain relationships. And so that like there were certain ones like with my college teammates where it's like I haven't talked to them in years, and I felt more free to share my recollection of what happened. But like there were other like stories or interactions like with my family where, and I'm not saying they were negative, I'm saying I felt like I wanted to kind of almost like preserve them for me. And maybe someday I'm like, maybe I will write like a part 2 of it, where it's like, because this is kind of like a coming out, and then it's like, well, what's staying out look like? Because that can always be challenging too.
Okay, so if you could go back and change anything from the book, add, take away, what would it be? Or are you loving it the way it is now?
No, I mean, I think that I could write more about now and my path after college to get to a place of personal acceptance, because and some of this is like the title and the subtitle of the book make it seem like I'm going to tell you the story of how I came out and then I'm going to be fine with myself. Whereas the book is really about this like 1 or 2 years, and then it took 8 years after that to really process a lot of it. And I don't necessarily write as in depth about those 8 years as I did about like this 6-month span. And so maybe I would add more about that growth process as I got older, mistakes I made, and then decisions I made, and then positive steps I took that could paint a fuller picture for people. I don't know why I just wanted to focus on like the tension between religion and sexuality a little bit more in this book than I did like wanted to make it solely about me and my coming out. If that makes sense.
That does.
Yeah.
And what do you think that we can all do either on campus or athletic departments to make it easier to talk about, stigmas around like coming out or being gay? Do you think it's just having a more open dialogue, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's still within athletics, sometimes a tough subject. I think it does depend on where you go to school. And I guess my knee-jerk reaction would be like Oregon would be a place that would be a little bit more accepting than necessarily like Heartland America universities, but some of it is just the culture within an athletic department, which kind of doesn't matter what town you're located in or whether Eugene is the most, progressive, open-minded place. It's like the athletic department itself could have a different culture within that culture that, I would never know about. But so on that part, it's on trying to create change, then it really then becomes about like the leadership within those places. And it's like you and I as outsiders to that athletic department can be like, we care about the athletes having an open and accepting environment, but like if their leaders within that aren't having those conversations, it's like it's very hard to change that internal culture.
Okay. And do you still, I know you talk a lot about like the whole stereotype of like basketball coaches, women basketball coaches being lesbians, and the whole recruiting process. Now that you've like gone into it more, done more research and everything else, has it changed from when you were in college until now, or where do you see it going?
I don't think it's changed as much as I thought it would, because for years it was always like, well, the next generation will come in and change the culture because they'll want to be out and open. And I think when people said that, I think they underestimated the power of the existing culture, because it's been very much a culture where like if you go into it and your intention is to change it, more often than not it changes you or you leave the culture, right? So we have a lot of young coaches who are like, whoa, I don't want to deal with this sort of like frightened, closeted behavior. And so they're like, I'm going to get into a different profession. Or they stick it out and they end up adopting some of that behavior. So it hasn't made as many strides as one would think, considering the strides we've seen. I consider them strides. Other people would be like, we've fallen backward. But as a country, we were talking about like marriage equality and the more general acceptance of definitely like LGB issues. I think trans issues often exist on a separate plane when we're talking about how people perceive the issue and the challenges and some of those things. I think within athletics, it's been a little more stagnant than I think we initially thought.